welcome to India Now. I'm Mark Fennell, and coming up, more than 300 million people practice yoga. But where did it start and how has it come to explode all around the world? Plus, inside the female-led society of the Khasi people.
I think there's a lot of mutual respect between men and women. We are very economically mobile and socially mobile as well.
And joining me on the panel today, poet, performer, artist Sukhjit Kaur Khalsa. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
And we also have lawyer and activist Tarang Chawla. Welcome to the show.
It's great to be here, Mark and Sukhjit.
All right, let's start with what's happening in India now. Avani Dias is the ABC's South Asia correspondent, and she joins us now from New Delhi. Avani, the national spokesperson for the ruling BJP party, has found herself in hot water.
That's right, Mark. It's been a really interesting series of events over the last week or so. Nupur Sharma has made comments on a televised debate which have been seen as really derogatory towards the Prophet Muhammad, and that has caused a major diplomatic stoush between India and more than 15 Middle Eastern and South Asian Muslim majority countries which have condemned these statements. Countries like Qatar have actually summoned the Indian ambassador and said to their face how disappointed and critical they are of these comments. And what we've seen now is this Hindu nationalist government led by Narendra Modi, which has had a history of Islamophobic comments by lower level members of the BJP, as well as being seen as cracking down on that Muslim minority population here in India. The BJP has now distanced itself from those comments. It's actually suspended Nupur Sharma from the party over this move in order to appease those Middle Eastern nations, which are very important to India. Mark, we've also seen lots of protests around India, as well as in Pakistan and Bangladesh, protests here in New Delhi, as well as in Uttar Pradesh, where there is a large Muslim population. And in Kolkata, those protests are escalating now. We've seen clashes between authorities and protesters.
It's quite an interesting move from the Indian government. Professor Samina Yassim is the head of the University of Western Australia's Centre for Muslim States and Societies, and this is what she made of the Modi government's response.
The sad thing is that it's only come about only when economic interests of the Indian government and Indian businesses seems to be under threat. Because India has a very strong relationship with Gulf states, and they're the ones who took the lead, it suggests that somehow if it doesn't affect India economically, it's not worth taking into account. And I think that goes against what I think is a very strong Indian secular tradition. And that tradition is still there in the sense that there are a lot of Indian non-Muslims who are critical of the debate and the comments made by Nupur Sharma. But the fact that Prime Minister Modi didn't show his recognition of the secular dimension of Indian polity, I think that's concerning to me and to others.
So does that ring true to you, Avani, in terms of what you're seeing on the ground at the moment?
Well, it's really interesting, Mark. We've spoken a lot on this show about how India wants to be this global superpower, and it needs these Middle Eastern countries to do that. It's been really interesting to see that under Modi's leadership, he's actually strengthened these relationships with those countries in the region. In fact, the Gulf countries are worth $90 billion annually in terms of trade for India. We know millions of Indian people work in the Middle East. So these are really important relationships. And now we've seen this backlash. Now, Muslim people in India are saying that it shouldn't have taken a diplomatic stoush for the Indian government to take a stance like this. But the BJP has said, well, we've never seen things cross this line. We've never seen comments against the Prophet Muhammad, and that's why this action needed to be taken.
The idea that this is crossing a line, does that stack up to you given sort of things that have come out of the BJP over the last couple of years?
I think what's most interesting about this, Mark, is that Prime Minister Modi is going to take the path of least resistance. He has a plan to make India a global economic superpower, and that threatens a $90 billion deal with so many Arab countries is probably what's underlying this move. And I think that what we need to see from him is more unequivocal support of minority groups, but it's probably not going to happen under his watch.
Is there a sense, Avani, that this has worked, that suspending this particular spokesperson is going to calm the situation down?
Well, Tarang's point there is key, right? Modi takes the path of least resistance. He hasn't come out and condemned comments like this in the past. So it is really interesting to see the BJP doing this. But the Indian government's at a crossroads here. Domestically, it really capitalises on the Hindu majority population here in India. It has this Hindu nationalist stance. But it's clear now that in terms of foreign policy, it can't keep doing this because it is at risk of jeopardising these very important relationships necessary for trade with India. So it'll be really interesting to see, Mark, if this does signify a bit of a lesson for the BJP and members of this government to tone down some of the comments that we've seen in the past.
All right, thanks, Avani.
Thanks, Mark.
Avani Dias is the ABC's South Asia correspondent. Next up, it has been called India's gift to the world. I'm talking about yoga. Next week, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi will lead celebrations for International Yoga Day. Indeed, he's actually declared that yoga should be as much a part of daily life as the mobile phone. But when a good idea spreads around the world, it can be hard sometimes to keep a handle on the original purpose of that idea.
The actual pronunciation of yoga is yuj, means union. The tradition of yoga in our family goes back 3 generations back, where my grandfather was a yoga acharya, which is one of the highest degree in yoga, and he used to teach in some of the renowned school in Mumbai. The school was founded in 2010. The whole purpose was to give people the classical yoga, the traditional yoga, which many of them were missing for a long time. The yoga's origins are tracked deep down in the Indus Valley in India. Swami Vivekananda, the pioneer who was invited by the US Parliament, he explained the true meaning of yoga on a spiritual level. And that's where I believe that the first pioneer of yoga from India came to the Western world. I'll say that I think yoga is been taken by few people on a very excitement level rather than on a right level. It really hurts that this beautiful heritage and the science which has been there for so many thousands of years, just to attract few people, you try to distort it. If they had respected the origin, they would have not done that. Or probably many of them are innocent and they don't know where they are going. And they're just going for an excitement. I'll say that it's a responsibility of the teacher to understand what they are doing rather than the students. Yoga has always remained as yoga in India. There are basic asanas what they do, the pranayama which they do, the breathing technique what they do, and they meditate and they do the Om chant. So this is for us back in India, is yoga all about. Yoga tradition is there and it's deep rooted and it's a heritage of India for so many generations now. So that's where I feel it will stay forever.
Sukhjit, I think it's safe to say that lots of people do yoga and don't really consider where it comes from, the origins of it. So for you, like, where is the line between cultural appreciation and cultural appropriation? Like, how do you distinguish those two things?
I feel like different generations would have a different answer to that. And I feel like me and my mum are classic examples where I'm like a millennial who's like, oh, people get to take whatever parts of my culture and then leave all the like difficult parts for me to deal with. Whereas my mum would be like, oh, isn't it so great? You know, they're coming from the grateful colonial sort of mindset of people actually appreciating cultures. But I think that, you know, the answer to that is about authentically researching what you're doing, because something that you might be learning in yoga class on a Saturday morning might be harmful for you. So the exhaling, the inhaling, it comes with a responsibility. But at the end of the day, like, as long as you're questioning and aware of the roots, it's really important to understand where people are coming from.
What about for you? Is it important to know the roots of something like yoga?
I think so. And I think, you know, I don't practice yoga, despite what appearances might have you believe, Mark and Sukhjit. But when it comes to yoga, right, it is much more than just getting dressed up in your PE Nation or your Lululemon and a few stretches and poses, right, and putting yourself into strange kind of like bodily comportment, contusion positions. It is about what Sukhjit talked about, breathing patterns. It is about so much more than simply just bending your body out of shape. And sometimes I feel a sense of cultural ownership over yoga, even though I don't practice, I've never practiced, but I feel this sense of wanting people in the West particularly to understand and not just appropriate yoga and cultural practices, but really appreciate them.
Why is it important that they appreciate? Like, what's the difference there?
I think that there's a sense of, you know, what a lot of people from India feel is that there's a sense that people benefit from yoga, either financially or otherwise, but without understanding where it comes from. You know, when it comes to a lot of things we appreciate, when it comes to food and other things, we appreciate where it comes from. We like to know the story of it. We like to be authentic in our appreciation and our adoration of it. Yoga is one example where that hasn't really caught on. It's become, as the package said, a $16 billion industry in the US. It's, you know, a lucrative industry here in Australia. And yet for so many Indian people, it is just part of their day-to-day life. It would be so counter to the idea of making money or, you know, spending money to do it. It's really just an exchange of a lifestyle and how to live a better, you know, life.
Sukhjit, you do work that looks at kind of the overlap of Australian sort of Indian history and Australian Indigenous history. You must come across this area all the time of like cultural appreciation, appropriation. How do you stay on the right side of that line?
I feel like it's really new for migrants to be engaging with Indigenous issues. So it's really new territory for me, but how I approach it is how would I want to be treated if it was me on the other end? And I think it comes with respect, it comes with listening, it comes with collaborations that are authentic and ensuring that people are heard, the right people are on your team and you aren't the loudest person in the room. And I think that's where the equality and the social justice aspect of, you know, being a Sikh comes from as well. And right now I'm collaborating with a lot of Indigenous artists back in WA and wanting to create work that speaks to both our communities because that is something that we haven't seen before on TV, in theatre, in the arts, in the world in general. For example, I recently saw there was a yoga non-for-profit in WA that actually goes into Indigenous communities and teaches yoga in a way that when I researched the team, is appropriate because I feel like at least they've got South Asian yoga practitioners, at least there's some sort of consultation being done rather than grabbing something and rolling with it.
I think it comes down to dignity and respect at its core. And I think that's whether it's yoga or anything, when it comes to cultural appropriation versus cultural appreciation. If we walk into a yoga class, you know, in inner city Sydney, and we see woke hipsters doing their yoga, and we kind of get, you know, if you come from the subcontinent, even though I don't practice yoga, I get a bit of an icky feeling. I'm like, do they really know much about it? And maybe they do. You know, maybe they do, and there's some of my prejudice coming through. But oftentimes, you know, anecdotally in the experiences that I've had and others have told me, they haven't. You know, it's just something that fits into their Saturday morning or their midweek kind of Bikram yoga session. But it's so much more than that for people from the subcontinent. I think that's what we're talking about. We're talking about dignity and respect and understanding of where these long-standing traditions really come from.
It goes without saying that the subcontinent is huge and its borders are complex, but much of that division comes down to a decision that was made in the wake of the British Raj, and particularly a controversial notion encouraged under British rule that Hindus and Muslims were just too different to exist as one country.
Hello, I'm Pavan Luthra, and I'm going to tell you about a tumultuous time in India's history when British rule finally came to an end and the upheaval and tragedy that followed. It's a story of partition. Britain in 1945, bombed and bankrupt after victory in Europe, new Prime Minister Clement Attlee is looking for a quick exit to an overextended empire. While in India, Britain is feeling under pressure after decades of resistance from Mahatma Gandhi's freedom movement. And Gandhi is overshadowed by two men vying for control of India's future, Jawaharlal Nehru and Muhammad Ali Jinnah. Attlee announces Britain will withdraw from India by June 1948. Tensions run high.
Pandit Nehru, who calls for an Indian republic, is accused by the League of working for domination over the Muslim minority.
Everybody was afraid that somehow their rights would be mauled in the aftermath of independence. It was up to the Indian National Congress as the largest party to try and either placate or assuage the concerns of these people.
India's last viceroy, Lord Louis Mountbatten, arrives in Delhi to end the occupation as quickly as possible.
The only alternative to coercion is partition.
Fears of a civil war between Hindus and Muslims pushed Mountbatten to bring forward Britain's exit to August 1947.
They did not actually want partition. I think they granted it because it was the only solution they could see in order to leave on their own schedule.
British lawyer Cyril Ratcliffe, who had never been to India, hurriedly drew up partition lines, later admitting he used outdated maps and incorrect census data. The new borders split India's most populous provinces of Punjab and Bengal, creating West and East Pakistan, later Bangladesh.
Muslims of India have shown to the world that they are a united nation. Their cause is just and righteous.
At the stroke of the midnight hour, when the world sleeps, India will awake to life and freedom.
My father and my grandfather, parents had all said, no, there won't be trouble. We've been here for generations. And my uncle said, look, I'm in the army. I'm getting intelligence. There will be trouble. Just get your families out.
पता है हमने जाना ही नहीं ये वैसे एक दो रात रवांगे तो घाट उड़ जाएंगे बस ये ही भुलेखा दुनिया और कोई भुलेखा नहीं गल्लां ते इन्ना करनी कलेजा विचों पाट पाट पे डिगदा
When you have a complete breakdown of law and order, nobody is safe, and women were most vulnerable. And so this became a situation where making excuse of a general chaos and general turmoil to settle local scores in which many women suffered enormously.
Kashmir is the open wound left by partition. If there had been no conflict over Kashmir, it's possible that even despite this great trauma and all this death and displacement, that the two countries might have found a way to work together and to heal their wounds.
And it's an event that reaches right into the present. I mean, this affected your family, didn't it?
Absolutely. A lot of things that people don't know about is that Sikhs were majorly affected by the partition. Their ancestral lands of Punjab were torn into two. There were Sikhs on the Pakistan side, Sikhs on the India side, and it really affects even family members in my family that are still alive today, and it is a wound that hasn't been healed.
Tarang, how do you see partition sort of reverberating through generations?
It's been intergenerational, Mark. We talk about partition sometimes like it was one moment in 1947 when a line was drawn in sand that separated India from Pakistan. One became the Muslim state, the other the Hindu state. But really, in effect, the partition was the culmination of years and years of colonial rule. And now we're seeing that play out across generations. You know, for all intents and purposes, I am an Indian Australian, but my family comes from the Pakistan side of the border. It's complex, it's complicated, and we're going to have to reconcile with this for many generations to come.
We will indeed.
The Khasi people are of Mon Khmer origin. We also came to these hills, they say 2000 years ago, or even before that. We are very famous for our waterfalls, for our caves, and we were known to be a very industrialist kind of society. And we also people who love songs. We are very musical by nature. And yes, above all, we are a matrilineal society. We take our lineage from the mother's clan line. I think there's a lot of mutual respect between men and women. We are very economically mobile and socially mobile as well. We can move wherever we want. We have what is called the sacred navel, the mother clan, that we owe all our allegiance to. The Kur is the clan. But with time and in the 21st century, we find that the clan strength is eroding. So we still have a robust matrilineal, but we have a lot of loopholes in our society which we need to mend. We cannot romanticize any society, least of all the Khasi matrilineal society, because not everything is right with our world. We are struggling to be the best version of ourselves. People parachute from the rest of India to come and study the so-called Khasi matrilineal society, believing that it's a sort of a paradise for women. But I've always brought them down to earth. Every society has very difficult gender relations because whether we like it or not, we are embedded in patriarchy. The Khasis are not immune to the influences from the rest of India.
Mr. Speaker, sir.
And of these 4 women, all of them are either wives or children of former politicians. So we may not be patriarchal or patrilineal, but we have imbibed a lot of those values. And sadly, at the moment we have 41% of households headed by single women. Abandonment and divorce are very common. Marriage is very brittle. There is really no way or practice that can hold the man responsible for the children that he has procreated. So I would like to tell people who come here, especially to stay here for a while before they understand society. Our lived experiences are important to understand.
Gender power structures in India are complicated, to say the least. Tarang, you work in this space, the power dynamics between men and women, particularly looking at India. What is it that people get wrong?
I think there's a lack of understanding about just how ingrained the patriarchy is. If we look at the Khasi community, they've done everything they possibly can to ensure that women's empowerment exists. But if we look at 4 out of 60 legislators being female, if we look at the fact that there are rates of violence against women within that community, we see that they're not immune to the pressures of patriarchy and patrilineal families that exist across India and the broader global context.
How does it sit in the Sikh community in terms of the dynamics between men and women?
Yeah, I've totally resonated with what is idealistic and what is in the Sikh scriptures and what is being practiced today. And there's that hypocrisy. I think a lot of young people and a lot of young women are now starting to go, hang on, this isn't cool. What can we do? What can we do about this? And that's how I started my sort of poetry journey, which was to talk about these gender issues. And the script is often different when I'm talking to my own community as opposed to talking to a more global community. And Sikhs are not immune to the patriarchy. We live within a very patriarchal society. However, in the experiences that I had growing up, you know, we had gender neutrality. My parents have the same name, which was a bit embarrassing when people would ring and I'd be like, oh, who are you talking? Who are you looking for, mum or dad? There was, you know, the wedding ceremony was all about 2 bodies turning into one soul, and it never specified who are these bodies? Are they what gender are these bodies? And I think there is some really beautiful things that you might read in your prayers every night, but are you practicing them? And maybe it's harder for people to practice things when it's not benefiting them. But I think my message to a lot of Sikh men is that, you know, feminism and gender equality will benefit you. Absolutely. But right now it doesn't seem like they see that.
But I guess we also have to acknowledge that many reports have said that India is a very unsafe place for women. I mean, I think something in the vicinity of 1/3 of Indian women and girls have experienced some kind of domestic violence. How do you rationalise that with sort of what I'm hearing from both of you, that there is sort of complexity within family structures, within communities?
That it's in your question that there is complexity, that, you know, it comes down to Indian communities and all communities engaging with these complex issues of gender. So, for example, my younger sister, Nikita, who found herself as a victim of men's violence here in Australia, but at the hands of a man of Indian origin, you know, we grew up in a family that was very gender equal. You know, Nikki's birth was celebrated as the first girl after 3 generations of all boys on my father's side. And yet I come from a patriarchal society, but there was a conscious effort to embed gender equality. My last trip to India, Mark and Sukhjit, I remember getting in one of the autos, right? One of the tuk-tuks or the autos. And on the back was a bumper sticker and it said, as well as driving this auto, I'm driving a campaign to end violence against women. And I just thought, how fascinating is that? That in a country that is maligned for views on women, that we've got a man of working class roots in India who's actively engaging in issues of gender inequality and trying to stamp out violence against women. And I had a conversation with him about it in Hindi, and we spoke about how he wants an India and a world that's safer for girls and women. And he, you know, argued about the right of his 2 daughters to get an education and to be empowered and to be financially free. And so there's complexity to this issue. There is an overwhelming patriarchal culture, but within that, there are people on the ground who are speaking out about it.
What will it take for him to succeed? Like, what needs to change?
A lot of things, but a shift in attitudes primarily. This idea that women are equal to men in every regard and that their life is inherently worthy and that their gender is not to be seen as an impediment, but in fact is one of the great strengths. Women's education and women's empowerment is the answer to poverty. It is the answer to so many problems within the Indian subcontinent and, dare I say, globally.
Sukhjit, what would you like to see change?
Well, I feel like, you know, last week we spoke about Bollywood, and I know this is going to be such a taboo thing to say as an Indian girl, but I grew up in the era of Bollywood that made me really uncomfortable, and similar era of Hollywood that made me feel really uncomfortable about my body just being an object. And when will we start looking at gender issues beyond the woman's relationship to the man? So unless you have a daughter or a girlfriend or a wife, like, can we not see each other as equal? And I think that's where this inherent desire has often, throughout my career been trodden on. I think it's really great that we have, my brother over here being able to speak to men. That's one thing I'm lacking in. I've tried to get through to the community, to men in general, regardless of being Indian or not. But I feel like it is something that we need to start having champions in each community and a lot more men in the conversation.
That is all we've got time for on the show tonight. Huge thank you to Tarang and Sukhjit for joining me on the show tonight. My name is Mark Fennell. I'll catch you next week. Until then, good night.